Hello. Many people know that the Titanic struck an iceberg and sunk. However, there's a lot more to the story. There were many other factors that led up to the actual event taking place and the immense loss of over 1,500 lives. So first, the design of the ship was had many errors and flaws that were unanticipated. Secondly, the combination of ego, negligence, and lack of training on the crew's part to avoid a disaster. And the last major cause was that the crew also lacked emergency preparedness training, which caused an immense loss of life. So the Titanic. So first, let's talk a little bit about the structure design of the ocean liner, the Titanic. The Titanic was commissioned by White Star Lines in 1911, and it was constructed and completed in 1912. It was a nearly all-steel ship. It's the longest and largest up to its date, and it was regarded as an engineering masterpiece, and ironically, was said to be unsinkable. So one of the first major flaws that we need to talk about is the use of rivets. Now today in modern ship design, everything is welded together and it's almost like one solid plate. However, the rivets that were used in the Titanic were, correction, the way the rivets were used in the Titanic was a little sketchy to say. What they did to save some money was they would use iron rivets in the front and the back portions of the ship where there were less stresses, and they would use the quality steel ones in the center portion of the ship. Now that came back to bite them because in the front of the ship is obviously where the iceberg hit. And the other thing with these iron rivets was the iron ones were cast on site, so they were of varying quality, and they could also include slag, which was carbon imperfections in the iron. So what happened is when the iceberg struck the ship, the easiest way to put it is the ship along the steel seams popped open the same way that a can of biscuits does. And if it would have been a modern ship, it would have crumpled in the way that aluminum can does. If you were to put a screwdriver through an aluminum can, the only portion that would be affected is that portion where the screwdriver hit, versus obviously the can of biscuits, which would kind of pop out. Now, another serious flaw with this was the use of compartments. And what I'd like to show you is the Titanic correction, the Titanic had 16 separate compartments, and it was designed to be able to survive the flooding of 4. Now the front 6 were flooded because of this biscuit can analogy, but the front 6 were flooded, and what I'd like to show you is right here, by my finger, is the water line. Now it was designed for each compartment to be above the water line. However, you'll see that each of these compartments do not go up to the entirety or to the top of the deck of the ship. So they were actually not even truly watertight. And what happened was the front 6, as they started to flood, the front of the ship dipped down, and this is what caused the major flooding of the ship and the eventual loss of the ship, was the fact that the water went over these compartments, and the ship compartments were truly not watertight. Now this was a major engineering blunder, and this was why the Titanic sunk in such a timely manner. So now that we know kind of what happened after the iceberg hit, let's talk about what led up to hitting the iceberg. In 1912, it was very common for ocean liners to go full speed through iceberg fields. However, this was during the day. It was not very common to do this at night, which is what Captain Smith, the captain of the Titanic, what he did, what he was warned about. He failed to make a corrective action or to divert south around the ice field in order to not sacrifice time and in order to what many believe to be is set a record. However, I disagree with that for many reasons. Excuse me. And one of those reasons is the Titanic, or the Great White Lines, they were actually proud of luxury, class, and size. They weren't really so big on the speed issue. Alright, so He chose to ignore these warnings, and he just chose to just depend on his spotters, and they didn't even have binoculars. And what happened was they saw the iceberg, and the second mate made the fateful decision, which many believe is to be the main reason they hit the iceberg, was he ordered a full reverse and a turn at the same time. Now what this does is it cavitates the rudder. So the rudder is actually not useful. It's as if you have a rudder on the front of the ship, because the water that's being pulled by the screws backwards is forcing that water to the front of the ship, and it's as if the rudder's at the front of the ship, where it has much less effect. And that's what caused them to actually scrape along the iceberg. And in my opinion, I would say that this is a failure not only of the crew, as a kind of a combination of negligence and lack of training, because this was kind of a common practice at the time. So now that we know why they hit the iceberg and what actually caused it to sink, let's talk about what caused such an immense loss of life. And there were quite a few training issues with the crew. First, when it was decided to abandon ship, the entire crew, at least the officers, especially lacked the training to properly abandon the ship. First off, there was only 20 lifeboats on board. It would have required 44 lifeboats to account for every soul on board that day. And what happened was the first batch of lifeboats, the first 5 lifeboats at least, left with a half of what they could hold. So each lifeboat could hold 64 people, some left with 12. And these were first class passengers. So status and being a woman or a child would give you the opportunity to have access to a lifeboat. They had a higher survival rate during a disaster, and this lack of training on the part of the crew caused many people to lose their lives because of it, because there were wasted seats on the lifeboats. Also, this lack of training also spilled over to other ships. When they had this emergency, they fired red distress signals into the sky, which other ships ignored because they assumed it was fireworks. And this actually went to change naval law that no firework could be used in international waters other than for the purpose of distress. So the Titanic even caused major sweeping changes in the world of naval safety. Now, one other final attributing factor to this was that in the Titanic, the actual radio room was ran by a private contractor, and they were not responsible they were not responsible for the company or any other communications between ships. So all communications between ships was secondary to the passengers' messages to friends and family back home, which it sounds unbelievable. And also the radio rooms at night shut down. So if something happens at night, nobody's going to get the message, and that's why the Titanic had such a late response. So let's talk a little bit about what we went over. First, we talked about the actual construction problems, cost cutting, and actions of the White Star Line. We talked a little bit about the causes of the actual collision with the iceberg and what led up to that and how it could have been avoided. And finally, we talked about, after it was decided to abandon ship, all the reasons that so many people lost their lives. This truly was a major blunder. Thank you.